So this is the third video in a series I'm doing on the painting of the Contemptor back banner. In this particular video I'm going to be painting the Reaper, which is the focal point of the banner. Now I have included footage in this video of a reworking of the robes. Despite having painted them to pretty much completion, I decided I wasn't happy with them and went back and redid them. Now I feel it's a really good learning tool for people that are maybe trying to get their head around freehand, that sometimes you may not be 100% happy with what you've done, and there's no reason, as long as you're using thin paint, you can't go back and rework something so that you get it to the point where you are truly happy with it. So with that in mind, let's crack on. Now I'm starting with the handle of the scythe, which I paint in a very thin down wood stain brown. And the reason I'm doing this first is because it establishes the angle that I will replicate on the other side with the sleeve of the Reaper's robes. I then follow this up by sketching out the scythe blade just in thin down black paint. Another reason for doing the scythe first is so that I can then scale the Reaper to fit into the space that's left. So now on to the general shape of the Reaper's robes, and I do this in extremely thin down black paint. You will notice that I paint some of it slightly darker. Those are going to be things such as the hollows in the sleeves that will be naturally darker than the remainder of the robes. You will also note that at certain points I will be tidying up as I go along, using a little bit of the same colours I used to paint the white at the background of the banner. I then begin to sketch out the general shape of the glass that makes up the hourglass. I don't bother with the wood at this stage, it is purely just to get the correct positioning of the glass piece. You'll also notice that throughout the process of painting this Reaper, I will be using a little bit of very sort of dark blue grey and going around the edges of the white that immediately abut the Reaper in order to put that shade around it and give a 3D appearance to help it to pop at a later date. I also replicate this on the skull pile as well. So now we've got the basic shapes laid down, I begin to add in more detail, starting with the skull. So as I do with all freehand skulls, I start by painting 3 circles in the base coat colour, one large one to create the cranium, two smaller ones to create the cheekbones, and then a square below that to create the upper jaw. Once that's done, I then take some thin down black paint and paint in the eye sockets and the nose cavity. Then once that general shape is all established, I'll begin to add linen white to the base coat colour and highlight up. Obviously the highlighting of this is done exactly the same as any other Sculler paint, very much focusing on a zenithal highlight style. And you use the highlights to create the definition and the shape of the skull. Don't be afraid to also use shade colours to add a little bit more definition into the recesses to really make those raised parts pop that little bit more if necessary. So now the skull's finished, I start by painting the outline of the hood over the edges of the skull that's just been finished. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the robes that I'm currently painting didn't turn out how I wanted them to, and as such I repainted over them. However, I've cut out a big chunk of the first attempt at painting the robes so that you don't have to sit and watch me paint them twice. Now, although these aren't terrible, they're just a little bit bland. So now I decide to just make the robes a little bit more interesting by opening that front up so I can at a later date put a little bit of bone, like rib cage, etc. into the recess, and also have them sort of opening up and flowing more. Now it's worth noting that because I use such thin paint when I do all this, going over it in this manner is not a massive problem. You still maintain that nice smooth finish at the end. Whereas I started black in the first attempt, I've gone with a more mid-tone grey as the base colour, and I'm just merely going to be adding white to that in increasing amounts to highlight, and black in order to shade. You'll also note that I have reduced the amount of folds in order to make them more pronounced and able to get that smoother blend from light to dark. And it also doesn't end up looking like a stripy jumper, which was one of my major criticisms of the first attempt. So as you can see, I'm building up those highlights by merely adding progressively more white to the mix and painting less and less of the robes. So now we're actually at pure white for the highlights. So now I'm happy with the highlighting. I'm going to start adding some more shade just to bring out those folds a little bit more. And this is done with a very thin down black. And as you can see, that's really making those look so much more interesting now. So now the robes are done, I want to start adding in the remainder of the skeleton. So that includes his hands and the rib cage. And this is as simple as just looking at a picture of a skeleton and doing the individual bones. I start off by base coating in a khaki and then just adding slightly more linen white to highlight. The great thing about skeletal structure is that it's pretty much just a mixture of lines and circles, and it's very much matter of fact as to where they need to go. So that's why you have the reference in front of you so that you know where each individual bone needs to be. If you wanted to go that extra mile, what you could do is obtain a skeletal model with fully articulated limbs, fingers, etc. And then every time you painted a skeleton, you could move the hands, etc. into the correct orientations that you needed, and then copy exactly the way that the bones look. So here I was actually really unhappy with the orientation of that hand. It was just looking really odd, so I turned it so that the fist is looking more towards us as he's holding the hourglass, and by doing that it just made it look so much better. So you'll notice as I paint the rib cage, I'm doing it and trying to get it so that it almost fades into the void that is his cloak. So I did this by highlighting the rib cage quite high, as this sort of protrudes out anyway, but then as it starts to go down into the pelvis, using very, very dark colours, even adding a tiny little bit of black to the base coat colour, and also painting in a very, very thinned down version of it so that it becomes sort of very, very subtle. So with the hourglass I begin by painting the wooden struts and the two ends of it. Then once that's done, I paint a tiny bit of very, very thin down beige colour to represent the sand in the bottom of the hourglass. Then I follow that up by painting the actual glass in a similar manner to painting a gem. So I wasn't particularly happy with the way the glass was turning out, so I started again, base coating it all blue, and then beginning to pick out the edges of the glass with a thin down white. I then begin to add in the sand again, but this time highlighting it up a little bit more. I then begin to add in the light blooms and glaze in a light blue over into the sanded area, so it breaks down that harsh line between the sand and the clear glass. Then in order to create the light blooms properly, I just add progressively more white to each layer until I'm left with pure white, and this is usually in a single dot. With an hourglass I'm always going backwards and forwards between light and dark, and also between the empty glass and the sand, so there's lots of overglazing and reapplication of highlights. I'm now also repainting on the supports between the top and the bottom, as when I repainted the glass I decided to remove those and start with just the glass. So now all I'm doing is, once everything's in place, I'm just readjusting those highlights on all parts of that hourglass. Followed by a very thin black line around the edge just to make that hourglass pop. So then on to the SCYTHE handle. Now all I'm doing here is just painting it up from a dark brown to a light brown. So now we've got up to a point where it's almost cream highlights on the very edges. I'm also taking this opportunity to help define the Reaper and the skull pilot a bit further by applying a very thin down glaze of ash and blue mixed with black around the edges. So now I'm going back in and highlighting the handle of the scythe up even further. So now I bring out a sepia glaze in order to knock back that wood a little bit. And what I do now is go back in and start reapplying some of the highlights. So now I'm happy with the shaft of the scythe, and I'm now going to start the blade. I'm going to be doing this in a non-metallic effect, so essentially I'm using white and black and also a tiny amount of blue just to help define it as being something slightly different from the grey that was used in the robes. But at the same time it's the same blue that was used in the hourglass, so it helps to tie it all in together. And this is just merely added to all the different mixes. Now the single biggest thing to understand about non-metallic metal effect is contrast. You essentially need to have light immediately butting onto dark in order to have that stark contrast to really make things pop. So you'll notice I've gone and painted almost like a checker effect down the blade, and starting with a mid-tone, highlighting it up in parts to white and shading it down in parts to black. As with everything I've done so far, the paints are in a glaze consistency. You'll notice as I'm painting this blade that there are instances where I'm glazing back over what I've already done with, say, a darker colour, and then reapplying the highlight again just to get that nice smooth blend. It's worth noting that, as with pretty much all of my painting, when I paint, my brush strokes are always towards the lightest or darkest point. So in the case of a highlight, the brush stroke ends at the lightest point, and with a shade the brush stroke ends at the darkest point. The reason for this is that at the end of the brush stroke, when the brush leaves the model, it deposits more pigment than it did at the beginning of the brush stroke. As such, if you're using a lighter paint at the end of that brush stroke, you'll have a lighter point, and if you're using a darker paint at the end of the brush stroke, you'll have a darker point. So now we've got down to pretty much pure white, and we're just painting the sort of the edges of the blade and the very, very extreme highlights on those reflections. And in order to make it all pop that little bit more, I go back in with the mixture of ashen blue and black, thin down, and just give an edge to the entire blade. So that's the Reaper done, and now this banner's really starting to take shape. So there is one more video left, and until then, you take care and happy painting.